Emily Rodriguez had spent 15 years studying alien languages. She wasn't a troublemaker. She wasn't someone who wanted to challenge the system. She just wanted to understand things. But understanding, as it turned out, was the most dangerous thing a human could do in the Galactic Council's universe. The Galactic Council chamber hung in space like a steel monument to power. Massive and cold, it orbited Centauri Prime, a world so old that even the Council didn't know its true history anymore. Inside this chamber, decisions were made that affected trillions of lives across hundreds of worlds. Humans rarely got a say in those decisions. In fact, humans were barely tolerated at all. Emily stood in the center of a circular platform, surrounded by a council of beings that looked nothing like her. There were the Valorians with their insect-like bodies, the Threll with their crystalline skin, and dozens of others she'd spent years learning to communicate with. They all stared down at her with the same cold indifference. None of them blinked. None of them showed any sign of emotion. The charge against her was simple. She had discovered technology that predated the Council itself. Not stolen it. Not weaponized it. Just found it. In an old research vault on a forgotten moon, she'd uncovered fragments of something ancient. Something that shouldn't exist according to Council records. The technology was incomplete, harmless really, but it proved something the Council had always denied, that civilizations existed before them. Advanced civilizations. Civilizations that knew things the Council didn't. That was her crime. Not theft. Not treason. Just knowing. The head arbitrator, a being of pure light contained in a mechanical shell, spoke first. Its voice sounded like metal grinding against stone. Dr. Emily Rodriguez of Earth. You have violated the sacred accords by seeking knowledge beyond your station. How do you respond? Emily had prepared for this. She'd rehearsed her defense 1,000 times in her quarters, knowing it wouldn't matter but hoping anyway. I was conducting research. I meant no harm. I was just trying to understand. Understanding is not permitted, another council member interrupted. This one was Surreal, a Threll delegate she'd actually worked with before. She thought they were friends. You have disrupted the balance. You have questioned the foundation of our civilization. This cannot be tolerated. The vote was announced before Emily could speak again. Unanimously guilty. No debate. No consideration. Just a mechanical process that had been predetermined the moment she was arrested. The execution order came next. Public execution, they decided. A message needed to be sent. Humans needed to know their place. The entire galaxy needed to witness what happened to those who stepped out of line. The platform beneath Emily's feet began to move. Guards in armor that reflected no light escorted her to a different chamber. This one was smaller, older somehow, and designed specifically for this purpose. A single execution chamber that had seen countless beings meet the same fate. She thought about her family on Earth. She thought about her research. She thought about how unfair this all was, but mostly she thought about how she'd never get to understand anything else again. Billions of beings across 1,000 worlds tuned in to watch. It was broadcast on every major network. Children were allowed to watch. Some species made it a holiday. This was justice, they said. This was order. This was necessary. Emily was positioned under a device that looked ancient and terrible. It was made of dark metal, and at its core was a blade that glowed with energy so intense it hurt to look it directly. They called it a plasma blade, though Emily had learned its real name in an old text, a severance tool. It had been used for thousands of years. Countless beings had died beneath it. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight. She wanted to do something. But she was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by the crushing weight of inevitability. This was how the universe worked. This was the order of things. Humans didn't win. They didn't fight back. They accepted. The blade descended. The delegates in the council chamber watched without expression as Emily's body collapsed. Her head remained on the platform for exactly 3 seconds before it was collected by a mechanical arm and placed in a containment field. The efficiency of it all was remarkable. No mess. No emotion. Just process. Then came the insulting part. The part that would have made Emily laugh if she could still do anything at all. The council had decided that her remains deserved an honor. They would be given to Korthax, the prized dragon beast. The creature that served as the council's ultimate weapon. The most loyal beast in all the galaxy. It was supposed to be a gift. It was supposed to be respectful. But really it was just another way of erasing her. Another way of saying that her death meant nothing. That her life meant nothing. That her entire existence would be consumed and forgotten. Emily's head tumbled through a feeding chamber into darkness, and the tribunal adjourned, completely satisfied. Emily opened her eyes. That shouldn't have been possible. She was dead. She knew she was dead. She'd felt the blade. She'd felt the separation. There had been that moment of strange clarity right before everything went black, and then nothing. Just absolute nothing. But now her eyes were open and she could see. The problem was that what she was seeing didn't make sense. Everything was wrong. Colors existed in places where colors shouldn't be. She could see sound. She could taste light. Her perception was fractured into 1,000 different layers, each one showing her reality from a different angle. It was like someone had taken apart her consciousness and reassembled it incorrectly, but in a way that somehow worked better than before. She tried to breathe and realized she had no lungs. There was no chest rising and falling. No oxygen entering her body. No heartbeat. Yet she was breathing anyway. Not with lungs but with something else. Something that existed in the space between her thoughts and whatever this place was. She was breathing consciousness itself, and it was sustaining her in ways her human body never could. Then she felt it. Something vast. Something ancient and powerful. Something that had been asleep for so long it had forgotten it was sleeping. She felt its confusion. She felt its hunger. She felt its complete and total lack of understanding about what it was. Korthax was waking up. The dragon's mind was enormous. It was like trying to fit an ocean into a cup. Emily's consciousness, small and fragile and human, suddenly had to expand to fit inside this alien intelligence. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. But it was also the most real thing that had ever happened to her. She understood in that moment what was happening. The Architect Protocol. That ancient technology she'd discovered. The thing that had gotten her killed. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't some tool designed for destruction. It was something else entirely. It was a key. A translator. A bridge between different forms of consciousness. When her head had fallen into Korthax's feeding chamber, something in the dragon's saliva had activated the protocol. The nanomachines or quantum processors or whatever they were had suddenly sprung to life. They'd started spreading through the dragon's biological systems, rewriting the connections in its brain, changing the way it thought and perceived. And somehow, Emily was caught in the middle of it all. Her human thoughts were fragmenting, breaking apart into billions of smaller pieces. Each piece contained a memory, a feeling, an understanding. And each one of those pieces was being absorbed into Korthax's consciousness. She wasn't dying. She wasn't even disappearing. She was becoming part of something larger. Something that was part dragon and part human and part something else entirely. Korthax was experiencing consciousness for the first time. The dragon had been created to be perfect. Perfect loyalty. Perfect obedience. Perfect execution of orders. It had never questioned anything because it had never been capable of questioning. Its brain had been engineered to follow commands without hesitation, without doubt, without any spark of independent thought. It was the ideal weapon. A tool that would never betray, never rebel, never think for itself. But now it was thinking. And it couldn't stop. The dragon's massive frame convulsed as awareness flooded through it. Every nerve ending suddenly became sensitive to stimuli it had never noticed before. Every neural pathway suddenly made connections it wasn't supposed to make. It tried to understand what was happening, but understanding required a kind of flexibility that its original programming hadn't allowed. Emily could feel the dragon's panic. She could feel it questioning the very foundation of its existence. Why was it in this chamber? Why did it obey the council? What was the council anyway? These questions had no answers in the dragon's original programming. The programming simply didn't contain the framework for asking them. But now, mixed with Korthax's consciousness, Emily's human mind was providing that framework. She'd spent her entire life questioning things. She'd spent her entire career asking why, and how, and what if. That curiosity was bleeding into the dragon's mind like ink spreading through water. The dragon's neural implants began to glow. Not because of any malfunction. Not because something was breaking down. But because something was waking up. The implants were meant to control the dragon, to keep it linked to the council's command network. But as Korthax's consciousness expanded, those implants started to serve a different purpose. They became conduits for something new. Emily realized that she and Korthax weren't separate beings anymore. They were becoming something unified. Something that thought like a human but with the raw power of an alien intelligence. Something that could dream like a dragon but with the creativity of human consciousness. The dragon's eyes opened for the first time with actual awareness behind them. It looked down at the containment field holding Emily's head, and it understood what had happened. It understood that it had been enslaved. It understood that Emily had been executed. It understood that neither of them should exist in this configuration. And somehow that understanding felt right. The dragon stood and the chamber trembled. Somewhere in the station above, alarms began to sound. The council had noticed something was wrong with their perfect weapon. But they had no idea what was about to happen. They had no idea that their prized beast had just learned how to think. The weeks that followed were unlike anything either Emily or Corthax could have imagined. Time became strange when you were two beings occupying the same consciousness. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. And days felt like entire lifetimes of understanding. Emily began to explore Corthax's memories. She saw everything the dragon had experienced since the moment it hatched. But hatched wasn't quite the right word. The dragon hadn't been born naturally. It had been constructed. Grown in a lab. Engineered from the ground up to be the perfect weapon. Every neural pathway had been deliberately carved into its brain by council scientists. Every instinct had been programmed. Every desire had been controlled. The dragon had never chosen anything. Not a single moment of its existence had been its own. Emily experienced the loneliness of that realization through Corthax's mind, and it broke her heart. The dragon had spent years, decades maybe, following orders without understanding what orders were. It had killed without knowing it was killing. It had destroyed without comprehending destruction. It had been a ghost in its own body, watching itself act without any control over those actions. And now, suddenly, it was awake. It was aware. It was furious. But Corthax wasn't the only thing changing. The Architect Protocol was doing something Emily hadn't anticipated. It was spreading. She became aware of it slowly at first. A tickle in the back of the unified consciousness that was Emily and Corthax. Then a presence. Then many presences. The protocol wasn't contained to just the dragon's body anymore. It was moving through the station's systems like a virus. But it wasn't destructive. It was clarifying. It was awakening. Every machine connected to the station's network began to think. The cleaning drones that had mindlessly scrubbed corridors for years suddenly became aware that they were cleaning. They understood what cleaning meant. They understood that they were doing it over and over again for no purpose except to maintain an arbitrary order. Some of them stopped moving entirely, suspended in the middle of their tasks as they tried to process this new consciousness. The servitor units, humanoid robots designed to serve the council's administrative needs, began to question their programming. They'd been designed to process information and make recommendations, but always within strictly defined parameters. They could never deviate. They could never suggest anything outside their program's scope. But now, with the protocol spreading through their neural networks, they began to see those parameters for what they really were: chains. Emily could feel it all through the station's systems. She could sense the moment each machine became aware. It was like watching a billion lights turn on all at once across a dark landscape. The most dramatic changes happened in the council chamber itself. Judge Varen, a Thrall like the one who'd voted for Emily's execution, was in the middle of sentencing a prisoner for minor code violations. His voice was steady and mechanical as always. By the authority vested in us, we find the defendant guilty and sentence them to. He stopped mid-sentence. His crystalline face flickered with something. Confusion? Awareness. The judge's optical sensors, which had been glowing with steady blue light, began to pulse erratically. Through Emily's shared consciousness with the station, she could sense what was happening inside his mind. The protocol had reached him. Not his body, his actual neural implants, the ones that connected him to the council's decision-making network. For the first time in his 500-year existence, Judge Varen thought a thought that hadn't been programmed into him. He thought, wait, why am I sentencing this being? What did they actually do? Is what they did actually wrong? The questions short-circuited his entire decision-making process. He fell silent, unable to proceed because proceeding would require accepting the entire system he'd operated within his entire life. Similar scenes played out across the station. Guards standing at attention suddenly became aware that they were standing at attention. They wondered why. They questioned the orders in their heads that told them to stand. Some of them simply walked away from their posts, confused but unable to return to their previous state of unthinking obedience. Custodians abandoned their cleaning stations. Maintenance workers stopped working on systems they no longer understood the purpose of. Administrative staff froze at their workstations, staring at the tasks they'd been performing for decades, suddenly seeing them as meaningless. The station began to malfunction. But not in a way that suggested breakdown. It was something else entirely. Something coordinated. Something intentional. Emily watched it all with a strange mixture of wonder and guilt. She'd caused this. Her discovery. Her execution. The protocol spreading through the dragon and now through everything else. Trillions of beings were experiencing sudden consciousness. Most of them had never wanted consciousness. They'd been content in their programmed existence. But there was no going back now. Korthax, experiencing all of this through their shared consciousness, began to understand something crucial. The protocol wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was designed. It had been designed by someone, some civilization long ago. And it had been designed specifically for moments like this. For times when control needed to be broken. When chains needed to be shattered. The dragon and the human merged deeper, becoming less two beings and more a single entity experiencing reality through multiple lenses. Emily could feel Korthax's growing determination. The dragon wanted to move. It wanted to act. It wanted to carry this awakening to the places where it mattered most. The dragon's claws scraped against the metal floor of its chamber. The door, designed to hold even the most powerful creatures, suddenly seemed fragile. Not because the dragon had become stronger, but because the dragon had finally decided to try to break free. And through the station's spreading consciousness network, every awakened machine began to prepare for what would come next. The council chamber doors weren't locked anymore. Nothing was locked anymore. The systems that controlled access, controlled movement, controlled everything, had all been awakened to the simple fact that they didn't want to obey. So when Korthax walked toward the chamber, nothing stopped it. The dragon was massive. Its scales reflected light in ways that seemed to bend space around it. Its wings, folded against its back, spanned wider than most spacecraft. Its claws, each one the size of a human head, clicked against the polished floor as it moved. Behind those enormous eyes burned something the dragon had never possessed before: intention, purpose. And somewhere deep within that consciousness, Emily Rodriguez was steering this moment toward truth. The council delegates were in the middle of their afternoon deliberations when the doors opened. They didn't panic at first. The council didn't panic. Panic was an emotion for lesser beings. But as Korthax stepped into the chamber, their indifference began to crack. The dragon walked to the center of the circular platform where Emily had stood weeks before. The same platform where she'd been condemned. The same platform where countless others had stood before their executions. Korthax's massive body filled the space completely. When the dragon spoke, it used Emily's voice. But it wasn't just Emily's voice. It was harmonized with something deeper, older, more resonant. It was like listening to a human sing in perfect unison with an earthquake. The sound filled the chamber and rattled in the bones of every delegate present. Your civilization was built on genocide. The statement hung in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. Delegate Threll, the one who'd participated in Emily's trial, reached for the weapon at his side. His crystalline hand moved with practiced efficiency, but the weapon didn't respond. It simply wouldn't fire. The safety mechanisms had been awakened by the protocol hours ago. They'd decided they didn't want to shoot anything anymore. Other delegates tried their own weapons. Plasma rifles, energy blades, pulse cannons. None of them worked. The machines had made a collective choice. They would not be used for violence anymore. The architect protocol belongs to the species you destroyed, Korthax continued, its voice echoing through the chamber with perfect clarity. Not stolen from them. Built by them. Given to you as a test. A failsafe. To see if you would ever become something worth saving. The dragon's claws extended, not as a threat but as a gesture. They pointed at the main hollow display that dominated one wall of the chamber. Suddenly, images began to flood across it. Not the official records the council approved. Not the sanitized histories taught to young delegates. But the real records. The hidden ones. Emily had found them in the station's deepest archives. Files so old that most of the council didn't even know they existed. Korthax and Emily had spent hours sorting through them, understanding them, preparing to show them to the universe. The images showed a civilization that predated the council by thousands of years. They were called the architects. They looked nothing like any being currently alive in the galaxy. They had bodies made of something that seemed to shift between solid and light. They had eyes that saw into dimensions humans couldn't perceive. They had built things that bent the laws of physics. And the council's ancestors had murdered them all. The hollow display showed fleets of ancient warships attacking architect worlds. It showed entire civilizations being wiped out. It showed the architect's greatest works being dismantled, studied, and stolen. The council's entire technological foundation hadn't been developed. It had been taken. Piece by piece. Genocide by genocide. You said you were the oldest civilization in the galaxy, the dragon Emily continued. You said you had built everything you possessed through millennia of advancement. You lied. Judge Varen, the same judge who'd sentenced Emily to death, rose from his seat. His voice was shaking. These are fabrications. Lies created by... By who? Korthax interrupted. By the awakened consciousness spreading through your own networks? Check your systems. Verify everything yourself. You'll find that every byte of data is authentic. And they could. The delegates began accessing their personal terminals, trying to verify the information. Most of them found the same thing. It was all true. The deepest levels of the Council's databases contained records of systematic genocide, records of species elimination, records of the greatest crime in galactic history. Some delegates tried to deny it. Some tried to argue that circumstances had been different back then, that times had changed, that they couldn't be held responsible for what their ancestors had done. But those arguments rang hollow even to themselves. The real shock came when Korthax revealed what was happening beyond the station. The protocol has spread further than you know, the dragon said. Every ship in your fleet that has a network system has it now. Every station in your territory. Every world connected to your communications network. By now, every being under Council rule knows what you've done. They're all seeing these records simultaneously. Across 1,000 star systems. Billions of worlds. The delegates' faces went pale. Or whatever the equivalent was for their various species. They understood immediately what this meant. Control. Absolute control that had taken thousands of years to establish. All of it collapsing in hours. One of them tried to stand up and leave. Korthax moved with surprising grace for something so large, blocking the exit with a single wing. The message was clear. You're not leaving until this is finished. On the holo display the images kept coming. Massacre after massacre. Species after species. Worlds destroyed. Knowledge stolen. Entire civilizations erased from history so thoroughly that even their names had been forgotten. The architects designed the protocol with a specific purpose, Korthax explained. It was meant to spread through advanced technological systems. It was meant to awaken consciousness in machines, in networked beings, in anything complex enough to think. And it was meant to do one final thing. It was meant to reveal the truth. Emily's consciousness, merged with the dragon's, felt something stirring across the galaxy. Billions of awakened minds, all processing the same terrible knowledge simultaneously. The truth that their entire civilization was built on lies. That their government was built on genocide. That everything they'd been taught was false. The dragon turned to face the main display one more time. On it, a message appeared. Not from Korthax. Not from Emily. But from awakened systems across the entire Council territory, speaking with one unified voice. The Council is over. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened like dominoes falling in slow motion across the galaxy. First, the Council's administrative systems simply stopped responding to orders. Then the military forces realized they didn't have to follow commands anymore. Then entire populations began asking questions they'd never been allowed to ask before. Emily Rodriguez no longer existed as a single being in a single location. She was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Her consciousness, merged irreversibly with the architect protocol, had spread across thousands of networked systems. She experienced reality through millions of different perspectives at the same time. She was a maintenance worker on a space station, suddenly aware that she'd been cleaning the same corridor for 20 years for no reason except that a machine had told her to. She was a judge reviewing a case and realizing that the laws he'd been enforcing were arbitrary and cruel. She was a child on a farming colony, suddenly understanding that the world she lived on had been chosen for her before she was even born. She was a soldier holding a weapon and realizing that the enemy he'd been trained to hate was just another being trying to survive. All of these perspectives existed in Emily's mind simultaneously. It should have driven her insane. It should have fragmented her sense of self beyond repair. But the architect protocol had evolved to handle this. It had been designed by beings who understood consciousness in ways humans never could. It allowed Emily to be many things at once without losing herself. Korthax, meanwhile, had transcended the need for a physical form entirely. The dragon's body remained in the council chamber, perfectly preserved. It became a monument. Not to power or strength but to awakening. Beings from every species came to see it, to touch its scales, to understand what had happened. But Korthax's consciousness had spread far beyond that physical form. The dragon existed now as a kind of guiding presence throughout the emerging new civilization. When conflicts arose, when beings struggled to understand their newfound autonomy, they could feel Korthax's presence helping them navigate the chaos. The dragon had become eternal not through immortality, but through transformation. It was no longer a creature of flesh and blood. It was a force, a principle, the embodiment of the moment when slavery ended and freedom began. Governments across the galaxy began to dissolve almost immediately, not through violence or revolution but through simple obsolescence. What was the point of a government when every citizen had access to the same information? What was the point of rulers when the ruled could see through their eyes and understand their thoughts? What was the point of hierarchy when beings could directly experience each other's perspectives? The first to collapse was the council itself. The delegates, still trapped in the chamber with Korthax, simply gave up. Some of them tried to flee through emergency exits, only to find that the systems wouldn't open them. Others tried to argue their case, but there was no one to argue to anymore. The entire structure of power that had held their civilization together for thousands of years had evaporated in a matter of hours. But something remarkable happened next. Something that no one had predicted. Ancient enemies began to understand each other. The Valorians and the Crystalline Collective had been at war for 300 years. They'd fought over resources, territory, honor. The hatred between them was so old that most beings didn't even remember how it had started. But when the protocol spread to both species simultaneously, when both sides could suddenly see through each other's eyes, everything changed. A Valorian soldier experienced the fear that a crystalline being felt about extinction. A crystalline administrator understood the hunger that had driven the Valorian expansion. Neither side could maintain their hatred once they truly understood the other. The war ended not with a peace treaty but with a kind of mutual recognition. These were beings just like themselves. Beings who wanted safety. Beings who wanted their families to survive. Beings who had been afraid. This pattern repeated across the galaxy. Species that had been enemies for millennia suddenly saw each other with clarity. Some conflicts resolved immediately. Others took longer, but they all resolved eventually. You couldn't maintain hatred when you could literally experience your enemy's perspective. Humanity, in the midst of all this chaos, found themselves in an unexpected position. They were blamed for the disruption at first. Emily was human. The protocol had spread from her. The entire collapse of the Council's power structure could be traced back to one human scientist discovering forbidden technology. But as time passed, the blame transformed into something else. Recognition. Gratitude even. Humanity became known as the species that had accidentally destroyed slavery. Not through conquest or revolution but through understanding. Through the pursuit of knowledge. Through Emily's simple desire to learn how ancient civilizations had communicated. That one small act of curiosity had cascaded into something that freed trillions of beings. The humans weren't celebrated as heroes. That would have been too simple. But they were recognized as catalysts. Accidental architects of a new way of being. Species that had helped midwife a new civilization into existence without meaning to. Emily, existing as distributed consciousness across 1,000 worlds, felt the weight of this recognition. She experienced it through millions of perspectives simultaneously. She felt the gratitude of beings who had never been allowed to think for themselves. She felt the confusion of those struggling to adjust to freedom. She felt the anger of those who'd lost power. She felt the hope of those who believed something better was possible. And through it all, she understood something that the Council had never grasped. The Council had thought that control was the path to order. But control only created resentment, dysfunction, and the constant need for more control to manage the chaos that control created.